Hey guys, what's up? Booksmarts here, and today we're doing another Zero to Hero guide. This guide is for the Affliction Warlock, and we'll be taking a look at talents, gear, stat prio, rotations, and playstyle for single target raid encounters, cleave raid encounters, and Mythic Plus. First up is talents. Affliction Warlocks have access to two hero talent trees, Diabolist and Hellcaller. Hellcaller focuses more on dot damage and empowers your corruption, replacing it with Wither, whereas Diabolist focuses more so on buffing your spenders and giving you a free proc for movement. At the moment, Hellcaller is worth taking in higher keys, such as a 14 or 15, because the ads will last longer and the dots will do more damage. For raid scenarios and Mythic Plus keys 12 or below, Soul Harvester is currently the best option. For single target raid fights, namely Sikrin and Kai Veza, you'll want to run with this build on screen. On the class tree side, things are pretty static. You very rarely deviate from this class tree, trading only 1 point even when you switch to AoE. And on the spec tree side, things are a bit more open. Since this is a single target, we opt for Phantom Singularity, and we also take Shadow Bolt over Drain Soul, but that's just a personal preference. Feel free to take Drain Soul if you prefer its playstyle. For any raid encounters that have more than one target, things change very slightly. The class tree actually stays exactly the same, and on the spec tree side, we drop Malediction and Contagion to pick up some more passive AoE. For Mythic Plus, things change yet again, but again very slightly. On the class tree side, we have a choice of dropping Fiendish Stride for Shadow Fury if our group needs the extra CC, and on the spec tree side, a couple small changes once again. We trade Phantom Singularity for Vile Taint, swap out Ravenous Afflictions for Death's Embrace, and drop Infirmity to pick up 1 point in Contagion. This gives us another AoE dot, and gives our dots some execute properties. Moving on to gear and stat prio. On screen now is a breakdown of stat weights for Raid and Mythic Plus. The main point of gear is to buff our stats, and the stats we're looking for on an Affliction Warlock are Haste, Crit, and Mastery. Mastery is useful to us regardless of the situation, so that's always going to be one stat we focus on. But for Haste and Crit, their value is determined by the situation. If we're in a raid situation, we'll only be spending a small percentage of the fight applying and maintaining dots, with the rest of the time spent doing damage. As a result, crit rises heavily in value in single target. In Mythic Plus situations, we want to spend as little time as possible applying our dots, so haste becomes much stronger, far outweighing crit and even competing with mastery sometimes. We are actively avoiding verse, just because the other three stats do so much for us. Intellect is still extremely valuable, so more often than not, eye level will be king, but always sim your character to figure out what the best items and upgrades for your character are. This season, our gear choices are pretty easy due to the power of some of the non-tier pieces, namely the neck from Sikrin, the ring from Queen, and the back from Rashinan. There are also quite a few trinkets this season, some boasting crazy stat gains, while others do massive upfront damage. As Affliction Warlocks, our two best simming trinkets depends on the situation. In single target, Spymaster's Web and Mad Queen's Mandate sims the highest, whereas against multiple targets, Unbound Changeling actually beats out Mad Queen's Mandate for second place. Shown on screen now is a preview of the best in slot for an Affliction Warlock in single target and AoE, provided no items are crafted. Speaking of crafted items, let's talk about that for a minute. Craftable items have been made some of the most powerful items in the game, and combined with the right embellishments, can actually become stronger than our best options, depending on what item you craft. Affliction Warlocks want their first crafted item to be the Vagabond's Torch Offhand, with the Dark Moon Sigil Ascension embellishment. If you can't find a strong one-hand weapon by the time you craft your first item, doing the two-hand staff will be just fine. Your second crafted item should be your shoes, the Consecrated Slippers, with the Writhing Armor Banding embellishment. If you manage to get both your main hand and offhand bis at 639, you still want to make and keep the Vagabond's Torch offhand equipped, as the Ascension buff actually outweighs the extra 3 item levels worth of buffs from your offhand. And since we're talking about embellishments, we'll also touch on gems, enchants, and consumables. Shown on screen now are the recommended enchants, consumables, and gems for an Affliction Warlock. Feel free to pause here while you get your information, and we're moving on. Moving on to the playstyle and rotation. Affliction Warlock's rotation is centered around maintaining multiple dots on one or more targets while building and spending soul shards. Because of the amount of dots, the spec can feel very overwhelming for some, so let's break it down. We'll start with the basics, then build from there. First off, we'll talk about our dots. We have 2 dots that we can have on all targets at all times, 2 dots that can only be on one target at a time, and 1 dot only available to us through talents. Our two dots that can be on everyone are Corruption and Agony. Corruption is normally a 14-second dot, but we always take a certain talent that makes Corruption last indefinitely. And Agony is an 18-second dot that stacks up and gets stronger over the course of time. If you refresh Agony, it doesn't refresh the amount of stacks, so when we get close to max stacks on Agony, it's very important to make sure it doesn't fall off, even in AoE situations. The two dots we can only have on one target at a time are Unstable Affliction and Haunt. Unstable Affliction lasts for 21 seconds, has some added PvP benefits, but in return, you can only put it on one person at a time. And last but not least is Haunt. Haunt lasts 18 seconds and has the added benefit of making the target take 10% more damage from you for its entire duration, but it can only really be cast on one target at a time. It's not restricted to only being on one target at a time, but with an 18-second duration and a 15-second cooldown, it might as well be. The dot we can only acquire through talents is Siphon Life. Siphon Life is a choice talent, opting between it or Absolute Corruption. In every scenario, Raid and Mythic, Absolute Corruption is the default choice, so we never have to worry about Siphon Life. A lot of our damage comes from dots, so I want to take a second to talk about dynamic dots versus snapshot dots and the pandemic mechanic. So when we place out our dots, they're going to tick for damage over, let's say, 18 seconds. Now over the course of that 18 seconds, you might get buffed, buffs might run out, you might get a proc, you might pop Bloodlust or a trinket. There's tons of opportunities to gain or lose stats throughout the course of a dot. Dynamic dots will calculate how much damage they're supposed to deal in real time. So if you gain a big buff, you don't have to refresh your dot for the buff to apply and for you to receive the extra damage. Conversely, snapshot dots will take a snapshot of your buffs at the moment you apply the dot, and will keep those buffs on the dot until the dot either runs out or is replaced. This is good to know because if you're in your cooldown window and you've got a bunch of buffs and extra damage and you use a snapshot dot, it's very important that you don't update that dot or refresh it, because you're going to lose out on all the buffs and damage that you would have gotten by letting it run out. So that's the difference between snapshot dots and dynamic dots. And for the pandemic mechanic, if you apply a dot that lasts for 18 seconds and you refresh it when there's less than 30% of the dot remaining, in this case 6 seconds, that refresh time will be added to your new dot, turning an 18-second dot into potentially a 24-second dot. This is important to know because you don't have to wait until a dot falls off to refresh it in order to be 100% efficient. You can reapply the dot as long as it has less than 30% of the time remaining, and you won't lose any damage for it. Luckily for us, Affliction Warlock's dots are all dynamic dots at the moment, but it's best to know this information in case anything changes in the future. The next thing we'll talk about is our filler, which is either going to be Drain Soul or Shadow Bolt. In all scenarios, Drain Soul will come out slightly, and I mean slightly, ahead of Shadow Bolt. The difference is so marginal, in fact, that you can switch between your preference without losing more than 1,000 or 2,000 DPS over the course of a dungeon or raid pull. It's insanely small. As a result, you can choose your filler. Both options do have positives and negatives. With Drain Soul, you have to stay planted in the same spot for the entirety of the cast, and any procs you get towards the filler will only increase the speed at which Drain Soul casts. But if you do cast Drain Soul on something and it dies more than half a second after you started your Drain Soul cast, you get a free Soul Shard. With Shadow Bolt, you also have to stay planted for the entirety of the cast, but procs you get towards your filler will make your next Shadow Bolt instant, meaning you can cast it on the move and reposition much easier. So Drain Soul is stationary with slightly more soul shards, whereas Shadow Bolt is more mobile with slightly fewer shards overall. So pick your preference and get good at it. We mentioned soul shards a moment ago, so let's talk about that. Aside from mana, an Affliction Warlock's primary resource is going to be soul shards. Maxing out at 5, these shards would allow you to cast your Spender, Malefic Rapture. You get a free soul shard whenever an enemy dies with Unstable Affliction on it, and you have a chance to receive a soul shard whenever any one of your agony dots deals damage, so you get a lot more in AoE situations. When we have soul shards, we cast Malefic Rupture to expend them. Malefic Rupture does damage to all targets with dots on them, and the more dots they have, the more damage Malefic Rapture does. So far, the rotation is actually quite simple. Apply Haunt, Agony, Corruption, and Unstable Affliction. Haunt first because it has a travel time, and Agony next so it has more time to stack up. Always keep these 4 dots going and refresh when less than 30% of the duration remains. Use Malefic Rapture to expend soul shards as you get them, and cast Shadow Bolt or Drain Soul for your filler. And that's it. That's the bread and butter Affliction rotation. It's that easy. From here, we'll talk about things you might want to factor in. The first thing we'll discuss is extracurricular soul shard usage, or times to use soul shards that aren't in the normal rotation. Affliction Warlocks have an ability called Soul Burn, which lets you burn a soul shard to empower the next cast of some of your spells. This can be used to make your next gate cast instant, to give you a snare removal and extra speed after casting your Demonic Circle teleport, to give you or your demon more health via Drain Life or Health Funnel, or to turn your Health Stone into a pseudo cooldown, increasing the health gain and giving you 20% more health for 12 seconds. Making good use of Soul Burn will turn you from a good Warlock into a great Warlock. The added defensiveness and utilities provided through it are absolutely amazing and not to be overlooked. The next abnormal usage of a Soul Shard will be via Seed of Corruption. This ability is insanely useful for applying corruption to multiple targets at once, and should be used to do so whenever there are 5 or more targets in the group. One note about Seed of Corruption, it requires you to do a small amount of damage in order for the seed to pop, so ideally you want to apply the seed to whichever target you personally will be prioritizing in the pack. If you're just tossing it onto a group of ads that you won't be prioritizing, follow it up with a Shadow Bolt or a couple ticks of Drain Soul to make sure the seed pops. Seed of Corruption does cost 1 Soul Shard per seed, so be a little frugal in your use of it. And the last thing, other than wild procs, that affects your Soul Shard generation is one of your cooldowns, Soul Rot. But we'll talk about that when the time comes to talk about cooldowns. The next thing we'll talk about is our cooldowns. Affliction Warlocks have 3 cooldowns, and we'll start with talking about Soul Rot. Soul Rot is a 1-minute cooldown that places a dot on the target and up to 4 nearby targets, and does a fair amount of damage to each target. With talents, we can supercharge this ability so that each person affected by Soul Rot gives us 4% haste and crit for up to 20% total. Soul Rot will also give us 3 charges of Malign Omen, and each charge of Malign Omen makes our next Malefic Rapture do more damage and extend all our dots by 2 seconds. And not only that, but with hero talents, Soul Rot will also give us 3 Soul Shards for free. All these things combined make Soul Shard an absolute banger of a talent and a very strong cooldown that we want to be using as much as possible. The next cooldown is our special demon, Summon Dark Glare. On a 2-minute cooldown, this guy extends the duration of all dots on all enemies by 8 seconds, which is absolutely massive. And for 20 seconds, it just sits on the back and smacks its target over and over with shadow damage. For each dot on the target he's hitting, his damage goes up by 25%, so it's very important that while he's active, you have all your dots up. The last cooldown we have is Vile Taint or Phantom Singularity, depending on which one you choose. Vile Taint puts a dot on the target and up to 4 others for 10 seconds, and also applies Corruption and Curse of Exhaustion. Phantom Singularity gets put on a single target, and does damage to all targets within 15 yards, healing you for a quarter of the damage it deals. Generally speaking, you want to use Vile Taint in AoE scenarios, and Phantom Singularity in single target situations. Vile Taint is a 30-second cooldown, so it lines up perfectly with our other cooldowns, whereas Phantom Singularity has a 45-second cooldown, so you'll want to hold it to pair it with your Soul Rot. So, in single target, for raid encounters, our opener will look something like this. Haunt during the pre-pull, into Agony, into Corruption, into a stable Affliction, into Phantom Singularity. From here, Shadow Bolt twice, into Summon Dark Glare, into Soul Rot. If you have 3 or more Soul Shards after casting Summon Dark Glare, you want to burn those with Malefic Raptures first. Dump all of your Soul Shards into Malefic Rapture, and from here you're just maintaining dots, dumping Soul Shards and Shadow Bolting or Drain Souling as a filler until your next Soul Rot. For single target encounters but in a Mythic Plus setting, very few changes are made overall. You simply want to trade the Phantom Singularity for Vile Taint. That's it. Very few talent changes were made, and since you're only still doing single target damage, the rotation is very similar to Raid. Lastly, for group pulls, when the group is getting brought together, pick the prio target of the group, often the one with the most HP, and start off with a Haunt into a Seed of Corruption. From here, aim your Vile Taunt at where you think the mobs will be when it lands, then back on your target, casting Unstable Affliction into Summon Dark Glare into Malevolence if you're running Hellcaller. If you have 3 or more Soul Shards after casting your Dark Glare, you want to burn those with Malefic Raptures before casting Malevolence. And if not, cast Soul Rot, burn all your Soul Shards on Malefic Rapture, then it's right back to maintaining dots on your targets, spending your Soul Shards, and waiting on the next Vile Taint or Soul Rot. In group situations, it's also very important that you do not let Agony fall off of your targets. Agony is your strongest dot, and keeping Agony on your targets is actually 3rd on your list of priorities, falling only behind using Malefic Rapture if you have 5 Soul Shards, and behind your cooldowns. The last thing I want to talk about are some helpful weak auras. In my time playing an Affliction Warlock, keeping track of my cooldown timers and my dots, especially in groups of mobs, have helped me to get the most out of my Warlock. and I would highly recommend getting some weak auras to help you track whatever aspects of the spec you might find it hard to keep track of. And that is my 0 to Hero Affliction Warlock guide. With your newfound knowledge and skill, you should be able to take your Warlock into raid and keys and smash like never before. If you enjoyed the guide, please subscribe or smash that like button, and feel free to leave a comment telling me what class or spec you want to see a guide for next. Alright everyone, I'm out. Take care.